I have been blessed with the fan pick this week. Like I said, it's a doozy. I didn't even include like all of the most violent and gruesome details. I touch on them, but it's rough. It's rough. So just buckle in. This is the story of the 1980 New Mexico prison riot, which remains the most deadly prison riot in American history.
Oh, good.
There were, as we've discussed, a lot of factors at play that led to an outbreak of violence at the New Mexico State Penitentiary in this situation in 1980, but also leading up to this situation, all of which was well documented and all but ignored by the powers in charge and the powers able to meet these inmates' needs and make changes. They just didn't. Prison overcrowding and inferior prison services, which are common problems in many correctional facilities, were major causes of this specific disturbance. On the night of the riot, there were 1,156 inmates in a prison that had beds for fewer than 963.
Oh.
So people were crammed into blocks with bunk beds, mattresses on the floor, makeshift
or not
sleeping
even
areas.
Yeah.
Piles of blankets if they were lucky enough to get them. First-time nonviolent prisoners, kind of like you mentioned in your case, were not adequately separated from repeat violent prisoners. Many were housed in crowded, unsanitary dormitories. PNM, that's the prison in New Mexico. PNM's food was of poor quality, a problem which was exacerbated by the prevalence of cockroaches and mice. So sanitation was abysmal. Intestinal diseases were common. A visiting warden reported that PNM was the filthiest institution he had ever seen.
If people are regularly getting sick because of the food and they're just not doing it, like someone's going to die.
Oh, yeah. And people did. People definitely did. Whether it was like accurately reported that way.
Yeah.
Is a deeper question. But these conditions were in fact deadly for inmates. The place was a filthy, overcrowded powder keg filled with powerless and desperate people. One spark and the whole place was going to blow, and that's precisely what happened in February of 1980. So by 1980, the New Mexico State Penitentiary was, like we said, severely overcrowded. It was originally designed to hold about 900 inmates, and the population swelled to nearly 2,000 around this time. This overcrowding exacerbated tensions among inmates, leading to a very volatile environment. Inmates were often forced to share cramped spaces, which contributed to feelings of frustration and hopelessness. The facilities at the penitentiary were outdated and poorly maintained, so basic needs such as healthcare, sanitation, and food services were inadequately met, if met at all. They also lacked recreational activities, educational programs. Like, they did not make any investments into this prison that would benefit in any way, shape, or form the inmates, or reduce recidivism, or allow for education, allow for them to reintegrate into society. None of that was available.
There's absolutely no kind of enrichment.
None.
They're just bodies existing.
Mm-hmm. This environment. Sorry, go ahead.
It's just horrific.
Yeah.
And again, I know
awful.
I understand it's a prison, but
but like, they're
humans
still
aren't
human
meant
beings.
to survive that.
No.
It's psychologically
It's torture. And it's going to cause major fucking issues that could have been avoided. This environment fostered a sense of neglect and abandonment, pushing inmates toward more violent means of expressing their dissatisfaction, because people would try to follow the rules, file complaints, bring their grievances to the appropriate hierarchy, and they were just ignored.
Mm-hmm.
Just ignored. Staff-inmate relations were extremely strained. Many guards lacked proper training and were ill-equipped to manage a high-stress environment like the penitentiary. So it was just like, they were understaffed, and staff turnover here was really high. So they were just like desperate to get guards in there that weren't properly trained. And then these guards wouldn't last long because the conditions were so fucking terrible. Reports indicated that some guards resorted to abusive practices, which only escalated tensions. The lack of effective communication and respect between staff and inmates created an atmosphere of hostility and mistrust. The inmate population was quite diverse, comprising various racial groups and ethnic groups. This diversity would lead to conflicts and power struggles amongst the inmates themselves, because there were a lot of, gangs that would form within in-groups. Mm-hmm. So these tensions were compounded by the overcrowded conditions as rival factions were forced into close proximity, leading to violence and further unrest. The security measures in place at the penitentiary were insufficient at best. Following a change in prison leadership in 1975, the penitentiary experienced a shortage of trained correctional staff. The facility was understaffed and many guards were inexperienced. This lack of personnel and training made it difficult to manage the population, the growing and overwhelming population, effectively. A subsequent investigation.
Angry population.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah.
A subsequent investigation by the state attorney general's office found that prison officials began coercing prisoners into becoming informants in a strategy known as, quote, the snitch game. The report said that retribution for snitching led to increased incidents of inmate-on-inmate violence at the prison in the late 70s. This whole dynamic sowed further mistrust of leadership and corrections officers and mistrust amongst the inmates themselves. Ugh. Which is a highly, highly volatile environment to be in, on top of all of the abysmal conditions in the prison that are already ramping up tensions.
Yeah.
Additionally, the physical layout of the prison allowed for pretty easy access to not just weapons, but like tools that could be used in an uprising.
Like so it was near like the woodworking shop or something like that.
Yeah, and it was really common, I guess, for certain areas of the prison to just not be locked.
Smart.
Yep. So when opportunities struck, it was fairly easy for inmates to overtake guards and arm themselves.
That's so scary.
Yeah.
I'd lock myself in a fucking closet too.
Yes. There were, we'll get to the folks who didn't want to participate, and there were plenty. But this was a fucking nightmare long before this uprising even started.
I feel like as a prisoner or a guard, a prison riot would be a pretty tough thing to sit out.
Oh, I mean, yeah, it would be terrifying.
You'd have to hide.
That would be my instinct.
Yeah.
The uprising was sparked by a combination of grievances and specific incidents leading up to the event. In the weeks prior, there were reports of increased tensions between inmates and staff, as well as dissatisfaction with the prison's handling of inmate requests and grievances. When people are desperate and their most basic human needs aren't even close to being met, on top of them being used as pawns in like prison politics and investigations, like this snitch game shit. Like,
yeah, that's
I don't know
sick.
what y'all fucking thought was going to happen.
Yeah.
But doy. Like the red string from the clusterfuck of issues that led to this moment is so clear.
Yeah.
And it was so well documented.
It is
and just nobody intervened and made any improvements.
Yeah.
And a lot of people died. The leadership within the prison was criticized for its inability to recognize and address the growing tensions among the inmate population. Now, I don't think it was an issue of them not recognizing the tensions. It's pretty clear that they just didn't give a shit about the inmates, and we'll kind of get to it. Like, this system didn't, and the people working in it did not see them as human, had no intention of improving the conditions whatsoever. They'd been asked to through the proper channels many times. Again, it was well documented how horrific this place was for well over a decade. And the powers that be just wouldn't spend the money to make any kind of fucking improvements. Because people at the top, it's, our prison system is privatized. People at the top are making money off of cheap labor, and they don't want to invest that money back into the conditions of the prison. You want to keep it as cheap as possible, keep your bottom line low, and it's just like using people as commodities. It's super fucked up. At minimum, there was a failure to communicate effectively with both inmates and staff regarding safety protocols and grievance procedures, and this breakdown in leadership contributed to a sense of chaos and instability within the prison for years. There had also been major incidents at the prison before the riot of 1980. So a rundown of one in particular from Wikipedia says, quote, in 1967, a work strike was organized by inmates as a response to the prison's poor conditions. In an attempt to subdue protesters, Deputy Warden Robert Montoya authorized the use of tear gas against the striking prisoners.
So they were prisoners who just weren't doing their prison jobs?
Yep.
And therefore not making the prison money?
Correct. So they went on strike because their conditions were fucking abysmal and they wouldn't participate in activities that were benefiting the prison and generating profit that they didn't see any reward for. And the response was, well, tear gas them and beat the shit out of them.
Okay.
As they exited the dormitory coughing from the gas, they were stripped naked and run nearly 100 yards down the central corridor through a gauntlet of officers who beat them with ubiquitous axe handles. Called the Night of the Axe Handles, the incident was corroborated by several eyewitnesses, including some officials themselves, and resulted in serious injuries as well as a federal lawsuit, which as of 1982, so 2 years after the uprising, was still pending, in naming Deputy Warden Montoya and a senior guard captain among the assailants.
Wow.
After this violent response to prisoners' concerns, one inmate, a man named Dwight Duran, was prompted to draft a 99-page handwritten civil rights complaint to the U.S. District Court of New Mexico, which was called Duran v. Apodaca. So I'm not sure, someone, a representative of the prison, I would imagine. Later to become the Duran Consent Decree. There was ample evidence from over 10 grand jury investigations between 1977 and 1979 about the conditions at the penitentiary, but the PNM administration resisted the changes and the legislature refused to allocate the necessary funds to make the changes. The last time the U.S. District Court grand jury ordered improvements was in 1979, which was only 2 months before the riot. So, they only ordered these improvements because things had gotten so awful that they couldn't ignore them anymore. But obviously, within 30 days of ordering the improvements, nothing is improved. These people are still not seeing the benefits of this lawsuit.
Do they ever?
I mean, this incident definitely leads to some reforms, but, as we know, prison reform as we enact it in the United States is not equitable. Mm-hmm. Some minimal improvements can be made to basically get the law off your back. But I would venture to guess things are not exactly phenomenal in this prison, even now, after all of this happened. So, as darkness settled over Santa Fe on the night of February 2nd, 1980, tension simmered within the walls of the New Mexico State Penitentiary. The facility, already overcrowded and understaffed, had become a pressure cooker of frustration and despair. For a while, some inmates had been watching the routine of the late night checks by the guards. So they would make these checks between 1 and 2 a.m. The routine was essentially one of the guards was the lead guard on these checks, and he'd have all the keys on him to the dormitories. And they'd unlock these dormitories one by one for additional guards to check the rooms while inmates were just standing nearby, just inside the door to wait for checks to be completed, the doors to be locked once again. They targeted this round of checks as an opportunity to overpower the guards and waited for the right moment to carry out their strategy.
Oh my God.
So on Saturday morning at about 1:40 a.m., February 2nd, 1980, on cue, 2 prisoners in Southside Dormitory E2 overpowered the officer that was holding all the keys before he had an opportunity to close and lock this inmate's door behind him.
So just visually, are they doing just cells where there's only 2 guys in a cell, or are they the bigger rooms with all the bunk beds?
There was both, but what happened, it started in this E2 dormitory, which I believe had individual cells that were unlocked for checks and then locked back up one by one.
Okay.
But there were definitely areas of the prison, and there are some photos that I pulled from one of my sources that are on the drive that you can look at to kind of see what some of the more group, quote unquote, housing looked like.
Mm-hmm.
It's not great.
Ooh, no.
But then there's also an example of like what a single cell looked like as well. So there's both.
Okay.
But where this originated was one of those more like single cell blocks.
Okay.
So they overtook the guards, including the officer manning the doors, and this meant the prisoners took 4 officers hostage. They had escaped from E2 dorm because they, got the keys. They had these hostages. They rushed out and overpowered the other officers that were engaged in trying to shut down the cell blocks at the south end of the prison. So they're trying to like get ahead of this escalation, but there's way more inmates than there are officers.
Mm-hmm.
And their doors in this cell block are unlocked for checks, and they're just pouring out and taking this opportunity. Officers Larry Mendoza and Antonio Vigil, who were eating breakfast in the officers' mess hall, heard men's voices in the main corridor. A prisoner in an officer's uniform was standing by the open grill, which is like a gate, apparently guarding it. So someone had already taken the liberty of disguising themselves as an officer.
And so there are like dozens of prisoners out at this point? Ugh.
Yes. Approaching the grill, marching north, was a hallway filled with prisoners. So at this point, it's like, it started with maybe a dozen, but they are opening cells left and right and gathering in numbers.
Whoa, this is so scary.
The officers soon realized the vulnerability of the grill being open, as this meant the path lay wide open for the inmates to attack the control center, which, operates almost everything in the prison.
Yeah.
So these officers that hadn't been overtaken yet ran to the control center and warned other officers of the situation. The north grill beside the control center had also routinely been left open most nights.
What the fuck kind of operation is this?
Shady one.
Yeah.
The 2 officers took refuge in the north wing of the prison, and the control center closed and locked the north grill behind them. It's reported that many of the inmates were also drunk from homemade spirits, which certainly added to like the chaos and overall mentality.
Pupo, or whatever it's called. Pulo.
Pruno. Like Bruno, but with a PR. So as the night deepened, the prison transformed into a full-blown battleground. Inmates barricaded themselves into various units, taking more than 50 hostages, which included guards, staff, and other inmates who had been caught in the crossfire, and also inmates that were targeted because we're about to get to it, but there was like a specific wing that was segregated for certain prisoners, and it was full of people that had been involved in the quote snitch game.
So they're in danger of violence from
other prisoners for giving intel.
Fuck.
A sense of both fear and exhilaration coursed through the ranks of those who had seized control. They lit fires, creating a thick haze of smoke that hung in the air, a visible marker of their rebellion against a system that had long neglected them. And events spiraled out of control within the cell blocks, in large part due to the actions of 2 rival gangs. The first were the Chicanos, who protected each other and dished out targeted retribution for specific grudges. Like, that was kind of their thing. The other gang, pause for surprise gasp, was the Aryan Brotherhood.
Oh, wow.
And was led by some of the most dangerous inmates in the prison. So these groups decided to break into Cell Block 4, which held prisoners labeled as informers.
Snitches.
Cell Block 4 also housed inmates who were mentally ill, convicted of sex crimes, or otherwise vulnerable to violence from fellow inmates. Because the hierarchy in prison.
Cops.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This area held a total of 96 prisoners. Initially, after taking over the control center, the call was to immediately take revenge on the snitches at the far north of the prison. However, to get there, they had to pass the psychology wing. So multiple prisoners broke into the psychology wing. They found storerooms of prescription drugs.
It was like Costco, like drug Costco.
Mm-hmm. The drugs were not only consumed by some inmates, but emptied into shoeboxes and distributed to other prisoners. Then they set fire in the psychology office in order to destroy the psychology records that had been used to keep some prisoners from obtaining parole.
Oh, damn.
One of the tools that they obtained to gain access to cell block 4 was a cache of blowtorches that were on the prison grounds for maintenance purposes. Without the keys to this particular cell block, prisoners used the blowtorches to break open the grills to the cell block and then methodically opened each cell and pulled the snitches from their beds.
Oh my God.
Many of the inmates on this floor were taken hostage, tortured, and killed, some by hanging, at least one by decapitation with an axe.
Oh my God.
And some allegedly burned alive with the torches that they'd acquired.
Blowtorches.
Yeah.
Jesus Christ.
Prisoners called out the windows to the state police that had gathered outside because they, reinforcements had been called in from the few guards
center.
that had and the control center was eventually overtaken. It sounds like it's kind of hard to determine, but like up to 50 hostages were involved in this situation that included some of the guards and a lot of the prisoners that had been labeled as, whether, legitimately or not, like you're a snitch, you're being targeted, basically.
So they were murdering the snitches, but also taking some of them hostage.
Yes.
Ooh.
Yep. So prisoners are calling out to the state police outside who were lining up just beyond the fence and pleading for them to save their lives. The waiting officers did nothing, despite there being a back door to cell block 4, which would have offered a way to free them and to enter and maybe regain control. As the door was intended only for emergency use and therefore never opened, they claimed the keys were not readily available, and this was why they couldn't get them out through that door.
No, they were just letting this fire burn.
Yep. Meanwhile, state police agreed with the prison negotiators not to enter the prison as long as the officers inside were being held hostage, were still alive. So, like, if those officers inside are still alive, we're going to wait this out and not come in.
Wouldn't you want to get them out?
I don't know.
Seems like the opposite of what they'd want to do.
Yeah. Among the hostages, fear set in. Many were trapped, facing the unpredictable wrath of the inmates who were fueled by years of pent-up rage. Some inmates did turn on each other, settling old scores amid the chaos. The walls were just fully echoing with the sounds of violence. They're shouting, crying, crackling of flames. Like
torches.
It would. I can't even imagine how scary it must have been in there. During an edition of BBC's Time Watch program, an eyewitness described the carnage in cell block 4. They said they saw an inmate held up in front of a window and he was being tortured by using a blowtorch on his face and eyes until his head exploded. And they did this like in the window so that the officers outside could see what was happening.
Oh my God.
Yeah. Another story was about an inmate named Mario Urioste who was jailed for shoplifting, so not even a violent crime. He was originally placed by officers in a violent unit where he was gang raped by 7 inmates.
Oh my God.
He had filed a lawsuit against his rapist, so prison officials had housed him in cell block 4, that like protected area, for his own protection. But then because of that lawsuit against his inmates who assaulted him, he was targeted for revenge. And he was killed in this uprising. His body was found hanged with his throat cut and his dismembered genitals stuffed into his mouth.
Oh my God.
Now, I want to be clear. I am not by any stretch of the imagination defending, condoning, or trying to justify the violence that took place here. And it could have been avoided. It's important not to give into inhumane and racist stereotypes about incarcerated people, but we also have to hold the context of how things escalated to this point, because that matters.
And the cops who are just sitting outside.
Precisely. So all of that matters in instances of violent retaliation anywhere in the world. And these people were pushed to the brink. Many of them were also drunk. and their most
or
violent
fucked
tendencies.
up on medications.
And yes. And again, it's horrific what played out here, and I'm not okay with what played out here. And it could have been avoided had the state actually stepped in to alleviate the issues within the prison walls that led to this riot. So I just wanted to clarify that. Like, it's beyond horrifying what happened to these people. It's beyond horrifying the violence that took place here. And it's beyond horrifying the conditions that created this environment that allowed this to happen.
I mean, I think likening it to a pressure cooker like you did before was pretty accurate because
Yes, it's going to fucking blow.
The pressure doesn't come from nowhere. And it's just over so much time. I mean, the state was, I don't know,
they knew,
say just as violent in some ways towards these prisoners just over decades.
Mm-hmm.
Ugh.
Yep. Hundreds of prisoners who refused to participate in the riot had huddled outside in the prison yard as tight to the fences as possible to stay like close to state police and National Guard who had been called in. And they were left there without food or water in the February cold. There's a photo on the drive of a message that someone wrote in the dirt of the prison yard that reads, "We need food," so that the helicopters that were flying overhead could read it and hopefully send them help. But
oh my God.
As far as I know, those provisions were not provided. As dawn broke, the outside world caught wind of the situation. Media vans were gathered outside the prison gates. Reporters were relaying the escalating crisis to an anxious public. Law enforcement prepared to intervene while families of the hostages and other inmates waited anxiously, praying for their loved one's safety.
What if you were the mother of that kid who got sent to jail for shoplifting?
I mean, nobody deserves a death like that, but it's just, I don't even have fucking words.
Yeah.
That guy shouldn't have fucking been there in the first place.
No.
Period. For more than 36 hours, negotiations unfolded amidst the chaos. State police and the National Guard were mobilized, and an uneasy standoff persisted. Meanwhile, within the prison, conditions deteriorated further. Food and water supplies ran low, and the fear of impending violence hung heavy. Some of the officers held hostage were protected and fed by inmates. 2 officers disguised themselves as inmates and were actually escorted out of the prison by sympathetic inmates that were still on the inside. 2 officers had been brutally beaten and raped and were carried out on blanket stretchers because the prisoners didn't want an officer to die while in their custody. Because like some of these folks in the hierarchy were like, this is only going to be worse for us if we don't try to alleviate some of this and get some of these people out. Like, certainly there were plenty of people in this prison with righteous anger who wanted change. And this was an opportunity, to potentially have their message heard. And then there were other people involved that are opportunistic. We see this at almost every, large protest, for example, who wanted to take this opportunity to enact revenge,
Just throw bricks and kill people who wronged you 10 years ago.
Yep. So there are lots of different volatile motivations at play here. And some folks are just trying to survive and trying to help within this really horrifying situation. 7 officers suffered severe injuries. Quote, one had been tied to a chair. Another lay naked on a stretcher, blood pouring from a head wound. Negotiations broke off Saturday evening and resumed in the early hours of Sunday morning. The negotiations were not recorded, and the government negotiators' strategy was to win control of the prison by stalling and just trying to let other prisoners that were being helpful in getting some of these guys out continue to do their job and just kind of putting off meeting any of their demands until they basically tired themselves out and ran out of supplies and food. On February 3rd, the decision was made to regain control. Armed with riot gear and a determination to restore order, law enforcement stormed the facility. The assault was swift and brutal. They moved through the smoke-filled halls, confronting inmates who had barricaded themselves into various areas, mostly for their own protection. There were a lot of people who didn't want anything to do with this and were targeted and just were trying to hide and survive.
That's you and I hiding in our cell.
Yes.
With our mattress over the door.
Yep. The sound of gunfire and shouting filled the air as the authorities fought to reclaim the prison. Official sources state that at least 33 inmates died. Some overdosed on the drugs that were stolen from the psych wing.
Oh. Mm-hmm.
While others were murdered.
So 33 total, not just 33 in the cops retaking the prison.
No, and I don't think any of the prison guards died. I think it was just inmates that had died. Because
during the violent night.
During the violence. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Because there was such a large faction, like kind of this whole thing was taken over by these two prominent prison gangs, and many of whom used the opportunity to enact revenge against these inmates in cell block 4 who were deemed as snitches or had other, reasons to be targeted.
Beef.
Yep. 12 of the victims had been housed in the protective custody unit, so block 4. Of the deceased, 24 were Hispanic, 7 were white, 1 was an African American, and 1 was an indigenous man. In comparison, the inmate population at the penitentiary of New Mexico during this time was 49% Hispanic, 38% white, 10% black, and 3% indigenous. However, it is believed that the death toll may have been higher as a number of bodies were incinerated or dismembered during the course of the event, and the aftermath left so much chaos and destruction. There's a couple pictures on the drive that they had criminal justice students from a local college that were helping sift through ashes and refuse, trying to find human remains to get an accurate count of everybody who had been killed. So we know for sure that 33 people died, but it is possible that there were more that were unaccounted for.
It's wild that anyone would be unaccounted for.
Yeah. But, think about the conditions, the overcrowding, the lack of oversight,
Yeah, and those fires probably destroyed some records.
Some records were destroyed. It was chaos, and it was already pretty chaotic leading up to this event. We don't know how, perfect that record keeping was.
So sad.
So we don't know, but it's certainly possible. The aftermath of this event left a haunting silence over the facility. Flames had destroyed several buildings, and the wreckage bore witness to the violence that had unfolded within the prison walls. In the wake of the riot, investigations began exposing the deep-seated issues that had contributed to the uprising. Reports revealed plentiful systemic failures, overcrowding, inadequate staff training, poor living conditions, everything we mentioned at the top, that had fostered an environment ripe for violence. The tragedy of the New Mexico prison riot would resonate far beyond its own walls, igniting calls for reform within the state's correctional system. Before and after the riots, Governor King's administration resisted attempts to reform the prison. One federal lawsuit that had been filed was, as we said earlier, handwritten by inmate Dwight Duran.
Oh my God.
He lost an inmate friend that he had known since childhood after being beaten by guards for 4 years before the riot. So
4 years?
Yeah, consistently. And this guy died.
My God.
He was eventually beaten to death. And that's what inspired Dwight to file this suit. And even though his case was not supported by the U.S. District Court, actual reforms were held up by negotiations for almost 2 decades. Actions were not settled until the administration of Governor Tony Anaya, a former district attorney, 7 years later. So it would be years after that event with Dwight Duran's friend, which was still in process by the time the 1980 riot happened. His case didn't even really make it anywhere until the mid 80s. And then they were still fucking picking their butts and basically trying to find ways to kick this can down the road for the better part of a decade after this whole thing went down. Much of the evidence in Dwight Duran's case was lost or destroyed during and after the riot. Some of that just from the natural destruction of things in an event like that. But it's not out of the realm of possibility that other stuff could have been destroyed and just blamed
it was
on.
Lost.
Yes. However, systemic reforms after the riot were undertaken following the Duran v. King consent decree, which included implementation of the Bureau classification system under Cabinet Secretary Joe Williams. The prison reform work from the Duran case developed the modern correctional system in New Mexico. So it was like a combination of this specific case further pushed through by the events of this riot.
So his handwritten lawsuit finally got the boost it needed because of this.
Because of what went down here and how public and in the media this was.
Yeah.
So like, as you know, on the surface, you see, oh my God, there's this prison riot in the news. Like what a horrible, violent, isolated incident for these inmates. And then more and more information comes out, including this lawsuit. And it's like, oh, fuck. Now we can't hide from this shit anymore. We have to do something.
Face the music.
Yeah. The events of those 2 harrowing days in February became a turning point for discussions about prison reform in the United States. The riot was a stark reminder of the human cost of neglect, and it left an indelible mark on the history of corrections in New Mexico. Well, I sure hope you liked that clip. If you did like that clip, make sure you are subscribing to our YouTube channel, leaving us a nice review, and joining us on Patreon for even more video content, audio content, salacious content all around. Come join us. Treat yourself.